Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Putul Sathe, Associate Professor, Research Center for Women Studies, SNDT Women's University, Mumbai. Today we are going to discuss the module. Title of the module: Introduction to Feminist Theories, Part 1, Learning Objectives. To introduce students to the diversity in feminist thought, to acquaint students with the larger debates in feminist discourse, to enable students to understand gender as a category of analysis. Introduction. This module will be a survey of distinctive strands of feminist thought in the second wave prevailing in the United Kingdom and the United States of America during the 1970s. The term second wave is used as a prefix to feminist thought and feminism and signifies the emergence of a specific kind of politics expanding the boundaries of the first wave of feminist thought. The second wave foregrounded the views of the earlier feminist thinkers and philosophers who tried to understand the social, cultural and political causes of women's status in the society. Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women, published in 1792, was a pioneering treatise of the first wave. Located within the school of liberal philosophy, liberal feminists held the view that all social categories were mediated through the ideology of gender, and hence femininity was a social construct that needed to be critiqued and dismantled rather than being celebrated as a sign of femaleness. Wollstonecraft is perhaps the earliest feminist thinker to challenge the essentialist notions of feminine qualities which were opposite to those of the rational virtues of human, read male nature. She challenged the perception of women ruled by her bodily, mainly reproductive functions and therefore lacking mental capacities, and argued for equal opportunities for women to realize their full potentials. She grounded some of the issues which later day feminists will focus on and argued that women had lacked the opportunities to develop their intellectual faculties and men's tyranny over women's enslaved state. Wollstonecraft challenged the sanctification of the private sphere and foregrounded later day feminist issues by questioning the power structures of man's private space outside the dominions of the state. Wollstonecraft appealed for women's inclusions as part of human species and challenged biological reductionism and created space and language for 21st century feminist theories. The writings of Wollstonecraft, along with other Enlightenment feminists, influenced the writings of abolitionists and suffragists in the United States of America and Britain in the 19th century. Quote, 19th century campaigners challenged the way in which women had no legal presence, simply becoming an adjunct to men in marriage, arguing that liberal thought itself accorded all rational creatures the right to self-determination, whereas women have neither custody over themselves, their children, nor property and income. Unquote. Liberal feminism provided the impetus to significantly transform women's status in terms of their right to vote. Feminist political thought in the second half of the 20th century has been informed by liberal feminist agenda of fighting for education for women, lobbying for civil rights for full realization of potential of women as individuals, and quote, accepting personal responsibility if they failed, unquote, and at the same time has tried to address the failure of the liberal school for not challenging the private sphere. Feminist political thought of the second wave began questioning the foundation of Western democracy, which was built upon the public man and the private woman. When women collectively began their articulation, they found that they lacked the language and were then dismissed by male commentators as lacking the correct discursive apparatus. Second wave feminist discourses were outlawed by pre-established intellectual theories which could not, quote, conceptualize a discourse whose difference were primarily hinged upon its gender specificity and which effectively destabilized or conflated existing academic disciplinary frameworks, unquote. The slogan, "The personal is political," summed up the distinctive character of women's movement and indicated the concentration of feminist discourse on women's experience and their individual accounts of the pressures brought by ideology of femininity. The domestic issues which had been excluded from the public sphere now became a powerful ideological site for review. Women's oppression. Feminist thinking in the second wave was marked by diversity and resisted categorization. Various schools of thought like liberal feminism, radical feminism, socialist feminism, Marxist feminism, postcolonial feminism, ecofeminism, existential feminism, postmodern feminism and third wave feminism marked the second wave of feminist political thought. These schools of thought signal that feminism is not a monolithic ideology and feminist political thought embraces a range of approaches, perspectives and paradigms to understand women's oppression and propose solution for the same. In the next section, 4 schools of feminist thought will be discussed. Liberal feminism. As has been mentioned earlier, 20th century liberal feminism in the United States of America was influenced by National American Women's Suffrage Association, who fought to enable women to vote. After a concerted struggle from 1890 to 1920, feminism lay dormant, and from 1960 onwards, a new generation of feminists assembled in one of the several women's rights groups, for example, the National Organization for Women (NOW), the National Political Caucus and the Women's Equity Action League. Influenced by the revolutionary spirit of the new left, their goal was, quote, not to reform what they regarded as an elitist, capitalist, competitive, individualist system, but to replace it with egalitarian, socialistic, cooperative, communitarian, sister is powerful systems, unquote. One of the most important voices was that of Betty Friedan, who was not only a member of NOW, but also the author of The Feminine Mystic, published in 1974. Moving beyond the radical feminist critique that liberal feminists were prone to be co-opted by male establishments and that liberal feminists were unable to provide an alternative to the powerful domination of institutions of family, motherhood and marriage, Friedan concluded that white, middle class, heterosexual, educated women needed to find, quote, meaningful work in the full-time public workforce, unquote. According to Friedan, the error in the, quote, feminine mystic, unquote, was that it overvalued the institutions of marriage and motherhood and saw them the answer to all women's human needs and desires. Therefore, it was necessary for women to interrogate these institutions and be engaged in creative work outside her house. And with some help, women like men could balance her personal duties with significant role in the public sphere. However, the feminine mystique did not address the serious issue of the difficulty faced by privileged women to combine motherhood, marriage, with public life in a situation where there was no radical changes made in the private or public sphere. Friedan, like Wollstonecraft before her, quote, sent women into the public realm without summoning men to the private domain, unquote. In her second book, The Second Stage, Friedan insisted that women needed to stop doing it all, and her solution to the superwoman syndrome was not to renounce love for work or vice versa. She advocated second stage feminism, which would require women to work with men in order to escape the excesses of the feminist mystique, which denied the core of women's personhood that is fulfilled through love, nurture and home, unquote, and to avoid the excesses of the feminine mystique, quote, which defined women solely in terms of their relationship to men as wives, mothers and homemakers, unquote. The major critique of this position is its understanding of human beings remain androcentric, and the aims of feminism is identical with humanism. Also, the classical welfare approaches to combat gender discrimination depended heavily on legal remedies, which did not address the structural and attitudinal impediments to women's progress. Beth Eilstein, in her essay titled Why Cannot a Woman Be More Like a Man, pointed out three major flaws of this position. First, its claim women can become like men if they set their minds to it. Second, the claim that most women want to become like men. And third, its claim that all women should want to become like men to aspire to masculine values. Secondly, according to Alison Jagger, the concept of the self, according to liberal feminists, was a rational, autonomous self and was essentially a male self with its adherence to normative dualism that privileged mental activities over bodily activities. Liberal school of thought privileged mental activities and its function over sexual division of labor and alienated women from her reproductive and domestic roles. And lastly, liberal feminism spoke only to white, heterosexual, middle class women. As has been pointed out by Angela Davis, that for many black women, domestic work in their homes was preferable to domestic work in white women's homes, and they would like to embrace the value of white middle class suburban homes. Finally, liberal feminism, for all its limitations, has resulted in many legal and educational reforms that has improved the quality of life for women, although there is, quote, more to feminism than educational and legal reforms aimed primarily at increasing women's professional and occupational status, unquote. The next school of thought is radical feminism. Radical feminism attacked the male-dominated society while evolving in different directions. It drew attention to the ways in which men tried to control women's bodies and how female sexuality had been constructed to serve men's needs, wants and interests. Radical feminists inferred that women's subordination was the oldest and predated all other types of oppression. Dissatisfied with the psychological explanations and, quote, searching for a materialistic account, it was inevitable that radical feminists should look to biology to provide an explanation, unquote. The most distinctive and original of the biologically based theories has been constructed by Shulamit Firestone. In her book, influenced by Marxism, Firestone provided an account of women's subordination that is both historical and materialistic. According to her, Marxism has focused primarily on how production of food, shelter and clothing was organized, but had said little about procreation. She claimed that economic reality was psychosexual and concluded that, quote, primary class division is that between women and men, unquote. The ultimate goal of feminist revolution should be to create an androgynous society which would obliterate sexual roles. With the disappearance of sexual roles, the biological family will also withstand her, and so will the need to, quote, impose genital heterosexuality as a means of ensuring human reproduction, unquote. The demise of family as a reproductive unit will also lead to its decline as an economic unit. However, Firestone's critics argue that women's oppression was not caused by female biology, but in man's control of that biology. This control could also become total depending on the type of technological development. Mary O'Brien asserted that, quote, if women is to free herself from man's control, she had to understand that the source of her oppression is also the source of her liberation, unquote. To counter men's control over birthing through technology, radical feminists conceded that since biology was one of the constitutions which defined women's identity, biological motherhood was a highly valuable activity. They distrusted reproductive technology since it would increase men's control over women. Radical feminists supported biological motherhood over artificial motherhood, but at the same time they condemned the institution of biological motherhood as constituted by patriarchy since it corrupted the experience of mothering. Radical feminists have also sought an answer to women's subordination through the patriarchal imposition of gender roles. Since the problem was gender, the goal of feminism must be androgyny. Kate Millett, in her book Sexual Politics, argued that to eliminate male control, men and women have to eliminate gender, specifically sexual status, role, and temperament, as it has been constructed under patriarchal ideology, and look forward to an androgynous future, and coined the word unisex. Mary Daly, in her book Gin Ecology, has argued that women need to only strip away the false identity of femininity that patriarchy had constructed for her and embrace her femaleness, and thereby challenge the woman-hating values of patriarchy by turning them on their head. Lesbianism for radical feminists served as a paradigm for female sexuality, and it was more than a personal decision. It had political implications because for feminists, sex was not a personal, private matter, rather, quote, it is a political matter of oppression, domination, and power, unquote. However, the implications of lesbianism extended beyond the sexual realm to revisit the ideological, political, and economic basis of patriarchal supremacy. Radical feminists have been criticized for perceiving human biology in an ahistorical manner and thus pushing sexuality, childbearing, and child rearing in the realm of nature. Human biological constitution is a constant variable influenced by the changes in human social life. Secondly, lesbianism has been criticized on the ground that absolute separatism is not desirable because women should challenge patriarchy by confronting it rather than isolating themselves from it. Patriarchy as an analytical tool for understanding personal and political is relevant, but radical feminists have assigned it an all-encompassing universal role, and thereby they have overlooked the rich diversity of historical forces. The next school of thought is Marxist feminism. Patriarchy has been understood and addressed in a variety of ways by different schools of feminist thought. It is also true that patriarchy as a concept cannot be understood in an universal manner, and patriarchies are formed in collaboration with other structures like class, caste, capitalism, ethnicity, and race. Marxist feminism, while addressing patriarchy, has tried to reappropriate it with materialism and approach, quote, women's situation in its historical specificity, unquote. Hence, patriarchal relations are influenced by the prevailing dominant mode of production, and as far as analysis of the position of women was concerned, quote, materialism would locate that position in terms of the relations of production and reproduction. In doing this, one of its central would be with the determinate character of the sexual division of labor and implications for this for power relations between men and women at different conjunctures. Marxist feminism borrowed the Marxist understanding of human nature, which saw little difference between the human and non-human world. The main difference between the two was the nature of their activity for physical survival. Therefore, in contrast to animal activity, human activity was conscious and powerful, and this has been defined as praxis. Praxis does not end here, since the satisfaction of the first needs leads to the production of new needs, and this production of new needs was the first historical act. This approach to understand the question of women's oppression was governed by the method of historical materialism. This presupposed that women's nature was formed by the, quote, dialectical interrelation between women's praxis, their biological constitution, and their physical and social environment. This also implies that one can have no a priori knowledge of nature. To understand women's oppression is to investigate actual women in their historical context, unquote. Thus, to understand women in a given society was to, quote, examine the kinds of labor they performed, the way in which this labor is organized, and the social relations that women form with each other and with men as a result of such labor and its modes of organization, unquote. Marxist feminist Juliette Michel, in her book Women's Estate, has argued that it is the combination of four key structures which define women's condition throughout history. They are structures of production, reproduction, sexuality, and socialization of children. Women's role in production has been ruled by sexual division of labor, which stressed her weakness and psychological metabolism. Women thus, quote, became an aspect of the things preserved, private property and children, unquote. However, with the advent of capitalism and technology, the situation did not prove to be liberating for women because technology was governed by existing social structure. Reproduction of children has resulted in withdrawal of women from crucial sector of production. The third key structure is control over sexuality through patriarchal family relation of marriage. The rise of capitalism has witnessed the establishment of marriage as a form of exclusive private property. Monogamy accompanied the rise of modern bourgeois society, and the logic of the capitalist mode of operation was also extended to patriarchal relations. The final key structure was socialization of children, and it is here that a woman achieves her main social definition. A woman's suitability for bringing up children springs from her physiological condition. However, it is patriarchal ideology that makes this suitability an inevitability. Socialization has been used as a mystique to cover women's oppression. These four structures operate through the social organization of family, which has changed with advances in modes of production. However, the ideology of family has been very important for the capitalist mode of production, which has changed from labor intensive to capitalist intensive, and the family has adopted itself accordingly. Besides the ideological role, the family has also an economic function to provide productive labor force and also serve as the site for massive consumption, the issue of domestic labor. This issue has been investigated by Marxist feminists not only as an extension of sex operation but also as a link between material and ideological operation. The debate on domestic labor treats households as part of the economy by taking the unpaid contribution of domestic labor seriously and the underlying ideology. The role of the state is to support and preserve social conditions of reproduction and production. By supporting the household system, it has played an important role in quote, establishing married women as a latent reserve army of labor unquote. Marxist feminist approach to the question of the nature of the oppression of women has been determined by an understanding of the social and economic circumstances in which men and women live and its relation to the construction of gender at various points of history. This investigation has tried to emphasize the idea that quote, gender identity and ideologies of gender as one part of the sex gender system are socially constructed rather than innate, and that they are created by women as well as men despite women's lesser access to cultural power unquote. Conclusion. This module has tried to trace the history of feminist political thought as it evolved historically, beginning with the first wave and moving towards the second wave. The three schools of thought which the module has focused on are liberal feminism, radical feminism and Marxist feminism. Common to all the three schools of thought is to understand the cause of women's oppression mediated through gender ideology, patriarchy, patriarchies and capitalism. Thank you.